Hi, I'm Nina Samuels, and apparently you have nothing better to do with your time, so you are listening to the Holy Shoot podcast.
Howdy, Holy Shooters! This week we are back with one of our Holy Shoot interviews where I, Jason, aka Chase E. Cornett, aka your favourite member of the podcast, interview people involved in the grassroots of professional wrestling. Your other favourites like Sam and Brod will be back soon for another wrestling challenge, but this week I have the mic alongside my special guest. And today I am joined by Jacqui Pratt, talented writer and lead singer in Cheap Pop, a really fun wrestling rock band. Jacqui is on the show to discuss her recently completed PhD on Rhetoric and Composition. And while that may seem like a really funny subject to discuss on a wrestling podcast, trust me, you're going to love this and learn something. So her PhD involved her writing up a very big dissertation, which included a 50-page chapter in which it was discussed the classic wrestling match that was the Young Bucks versus the world's cutest tag team of Joey Ryan and Candice LaRae, with this match actually used as a way to explore women in professional wrestling and some wilder theories. I recommend going and watch this match, by the way. It's really going to help going back and watching it now or after the show. It's kind of available on YouTube and probably officially from PWG, and it's from July 1994. Just look up Young Bucks versus World's Cutest Tag Team. I'm sure you'll find it. So the chapter in her dissertation was actually titled Blood, Thumbtacks and Tears, and subtitled Ambiguity, Action and Feminine Agenda in Professional Wrestling. The dissertation has a lot of really big words in it and quotes from the likes of Emily Reed of Eve Pro Wrestling and even Heather Vandenberg from our interview on the Holy Shoot back on episode 17, where we talked about her career and her now published book Unladylike. So today we're going to talk about Jacqui's writing, and then we also at the end talk about Cheap Pop and their album In Gorilla and her general plans to be more involved in writing about wrestling. Jacqui refers to wrestling as a storytelling medium that uses the human body as its primary expressive mode to tell narratives around the communal assumptions of justice. We went into detail about the old good versus evil, babyface versus heels, and it's all about that important spectacle of suffering, defeat and justice. The chapter that we're talking about from her dissertation really went into the detail of something Jacqui refers to as mattering, which is the conscious and deliberate shaping of knowledge to explore or articulate particular aims, purposes, inquiries and intentions. That sounds pretty heavy, doesn't it? Don't worry, we break it down so that normal people like you and me can understand it and really learn a lot. So it's actually the smartest thing I've ever read in terms of wrestling writing. Goes into really detail and it's got lots of quotes from really respected writers and academics, but don't worry, coming up next Jacqui's going to explain it for you and me, the standard wrestling fan. So welcome back, and we have Jacqui here now. Jacqui,
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you doing today?
Not too bad. For me, this is like evening time, Saturday. I've already done the gym. I've had a beer to celebrate going to the gym. That feels productive, so it's not too bad. And the sun is kind of out, so not too bad. And for you, it's morning. No, so it's lunchtime now for you, isn't it?
It's about lunchtime, yeah.
Lunchtime for you. So yeah, where are you right now?
I am in eastern Pennsylvania. I'm in a little area called the Lehigh Valley, which is, I guess, maybe most famous for Billy Joel has a song called Allentown, and that is a part of the Lehigh Valley. So that's where I'm located right now. It's about maybe like an hour and a half outside of New York and Philadelphia. It's sort of like a midpoint between them. So eastern part of the country.
So I'm in Woking, and we're most famous for the fact that War of the Worlds is set here. In Woking High Street, there are giant alien statues.
That is
which
awesome.
Is quite cool. Which is like that's our thing. That's our thing. So you're doing a bit of work today as well, but you managed to make some time out for this interview, which is good. How is life in general?
Right now, a little bit chaotic. I just finished up my PhD at the University of Washington, which is out in Seattle, which is, for those of you not in America, the like complete opposite like side of the country. I'm on the eastern seaboard now, and that is on the western
That's
seaboard.
very much in the top corner as well. So
Yes,
it's really
yes, it is north. Yeah. Whereas I'm sort of like nearing the mid point of the coast, not quite the mid-Atlantic, but like almost there. It's a weird region where I am right now. But I just finished that up in June. So summer has been a lot of me moving back to the East Coast, getting sort of settled in and established. Now I'm in the process of looking for like full-time stable work. So it's sort of this weird transition period where, you know, for so long the PhD was the goal. So it was like working towards this, building towards this. And now it's like, all right, accomplished. What's the next sort of set of things? And that's where I'm at.
Yeah. So talking about the PhD, so that's why we're talking today, because this came about because I discovered cheap pop, and we did the previous episode where we talked about like rock music or just general wrestling music, like you and the B plus players and so on.
They're so
and
good.
We've been in touch since then. That was back in episode 8. We've never actually spoken until now. We've been back and forth on like Twitter, like messages and emails, and we're finally chatting. And just from doing that episode and talking to you, you talked about your writing and the fact that you were doing a PhD, and kind of blew my mind with the idea that a chapter of that in your dissertation was actually about wrestling.
Yeah.
How did that actually come about? How did you get wrestling into a PhD?
Yeah. So there's kind of a couple different threads about this. So indirectly sort of just getting wrestling into this dissertation work, I started working with wrestling scholarship maybe around 2012, 2013 when I was working on my master's degree. And I was watching wrestling a lot at the time. And I was just like, man, there's just so much good stuff here that is useful for thinking about how meaning is made, these rhetorical processes of, symbols becoming something and being interpreted in ways and used in certain ways, and how they change and gain energy and momentum through use. And I just saw so much rhetorical potential in wrestling and in scholarship in general, not just in rhetoric, but like in any sort of like humanities scholarship. There's not a lot done about professional wrestling. It's just not a topic that's talked about a lot. So I sort of was like, well, I see something interesting. There's not a lot about it, so I'm going to start writing about it. So I think I first presented work and started writing about like explicitly. I had a chapter in my master's thesis about Daniel Bryan and the Yes movement and sort of the rise of that. And that was nice because it sort of coincided with his WrestleMania moment. So this was, late 2013, early 2014 when this was happening. And that's when I was working on my master's thesis. So I had written about him there and presented some work about that at a conference. And then just through that work started meeting other scholars who were interested in wrestling but didn't know what to do about it because it's not an established field. So it's just slowly taken up momentum. I've worked with a couple people on stuff about kayfabe as kind of a cultural logic or a way of thinking about or processing current events that are happening in the world. And I think now more than ever, that's been something to really dive into. And one of the key sort of contributions, if you will, that wrestling can make to studies and understandings of publics and of rhetorical knowledge construction. So anyway, it's a thing that I'm hoping that we'll start to really see take substance and form over the next couple of years as this wrestling boom starts to unfold. Hopefully we'll start to see more scholarship happen with it.
You're right. It's actually quite interesting to say that way because you think that it's weird to think of wrestling in a boom because it's been a while. But when you say boom, it's like the value of the TV deals that WWE has got, AEW launching.
Yes.
in the UK at the minute, we have this thing where Brit wrestling is dead. There's a bit of controversy because a few companies have closed down, but it's like, just trying to mature. But some of the companies are doing really well, So it's a really sort of weird situation there for the UK compared to the US, though. Before we go into kayfabe and the main thing, your main PhD discussion here, I just want to ask: you presented at a conference about Daniel Bryan and the Yes Movement.
I did, yeah.
So a bunch of academic people.
Uh-huh.
How many people did you try and explain Daniel Bryan to?
There were probably I'm going to say 15 to 20 people were in the room. So, the way that these conferences are set up, there are multiple concurrent sessions. So you might have anywhere from, 15 to 20, 25 different options to go to in a given time slot. So, people are choosing to come into that room for a reason. Some of them might have an interest in wrestling. Some of them might have, colleagues who are presenting, or just friends who are presenting. Some just might be curious, just what is this thing? I'm going to check this. So it could be a bunch of different reasons that people come into the room. But yeah, explaining wrestling to people who don't know wrestling is difficult because you have to take a step back and explain so many key fundamental concepts that we can just, use the banter, use the words, use the terminology because we're fans who've spent so long dwelling with it, thinking about it, being in it, listening to podcasts, reading articles, watching programs. We understand this terminology. So you really need to step back and be like, before I talk about this interesting person, let me tell you all this other stuff and then tell you why this is interesting, which is kind of what the chapter does.
It's a whole other level to, it's like the whole, when you have a drink with some friends and somehow you end up talking about the fact you like wrestling and you forget you have to explain these terms to them. And I've had it when I'm trying to explain to people, this is what I'm doing or why this show is so important. And and you realize sometimes you talk in terms about Marx and kayfabe and you're like, you have no idea what language I'm talking about right now.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have to do that in the writing what we're talking about, the chapter. I mean, you have to sort of pull that back a few times to make sure, but people would know what you actually meant.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, so we talk about that. So I explained this in the preamble what I did before we started talking and why it's so interesting. The PhD. I think it's fair to say there's a few key things. Right, it's mainly about you wrote about wrestling. It's focused in particular on this one match as an example. The Young Bucks versus the world's cutest tag team. It's a great one match to then go into various things. And you could talk about this thing. You refer to mattering. And how professional wrestling is a great way to explain mattering. Do you want to explain what is mattering to the layman?
Yeah, so that is one of the concepts that I'm kind of working with and developing in the whole document. So I've just mentioned this idea of dwelling a moment ago. And what I do is I sort of pair together these ideas of dwelling and mattering as two different, but not exclusive ways of making meaning or coming to knowledge. So dwelling is when you come to knowledge slowly over time by being present, by being there. So, as a wrestling fan, I've been dwelling with wrestling for a while. It's what allows me to have this kind of level of analysis with it. And that's one way that people can come to knowledge about all sorts of different things, right? If I have a porch and I sit outside on my porch in the morning with a cup of coffee, I might notice in spring the patterns of the birds and where their nests are. And then when the babies are being born and I can see the mama feeding the babies their grubs. And, that is a coming to knowledge that happens only through being present over time, that it's not something that is, deliberately taught or formed or, interpreted. That is just a knowledge of coming to. So I call that dwelling. So its counterpart is mattering, which is what this chapter is sort of a demonstration of, which is a deliberate shaping of knowledge. So this idea that we have information, we have learned things through a variety of different means, but what do we do with that knowledge? How do we apply it and make meaning and understanding of events, of situations, of interactions? How do we do something with that and make meaning with that, interpret that? And mattering is a more purposeful shaping of knowledge for an intention, for a purpose, for an outcome, which is what this chapter is. It's, taking a look, on a very real level, it's about the match and it's about Candice, right? It's about Candice as, an incredibly important icon And that moment of the Crimson Mask being such an incredible moment for women's wrestling going forward. But in order for me to make that argument, I also then need to look at like this very complex set of factors that are coming together in that moment to put it in a position to even be as impactful as it was in the grand scheme of things. So it takes some time, it takes some, omnidirectional analysis that's happening, but I'm deliberately looking at that information to kind of make this argument.
Cool. I was going to say, if at any point you go into too much detail with long words, I'm going to have to sort of call a referee stoppage or, ask you to back
Do
off.
it.
But I'll let you know if it
okay.
happens. I think we're okay so far. But I just want to make sure that everyone can understand what we're talking about. So, I guess that's what mattering is. And how does mattering help, I guess, with you talk about entanglements and like feud stories and how that works, and then how entanglements work in the way of like kayfabe and authority.
Mm-hmm. So entanglement is another metaphor that kind of is extended throughout the whole dissertation that you're only getting a piece of here. But I think, and this is, the argument that I make as a scholar, is that meaning making is an entangled phenomenon, that it's not just the static set of circumstances that we're responding to, but rather it's this dynamic living thing that can be both predictable but also unruly and chaotic, and things can happen that no one could even begin to project. So that if we approach the act of interpretation as this entangled phenomenon, it's harder, it takes more time, but it comes to more complete analysis. So what I'm doing is I'm using wrestling to demonstrate this, because wrestling in and of itself is a complex art form. It is a lot of things happening at once, and a lot of those things are often happening in contradiction to one another. So things that appear to mean one thing in wrestling are actually, when you peel back the curtain, something else. What appears to be a punch is the illusion of a punch that is executed safely to not actually harm the other person. And that core tension of illusion and reality often being two very different things, but they're happening at the same time, I think is really, really useful for thinking about meaning making writ large. And that's what kayfabe kind of factors into in the chapter. Kayfabe is this important lens of seeing how all of those things can be true to a wrestling fan, how a wrestling fan can accept the illusion, can seek to understand the real that's underneath it, without either being undermined by the other.
Sounds about right to me. And when I look at my notes, you're talking about kayfabe, and I mean that really comes in particular in the first part, talking about independent wrestling, I guess. But you split it. You talk about the four wrestling ecologies in terms of what this one match covers and why it's such a great example of it.
Yes.
And we can talk about all four of those and how they, I guess, come together. So the four, though, it's independent wrestling, it's hardcore wrestling, it's women's wrestling, and it's intergender wrestling. And this one match, you break down into all four of those.
Yeah.
So if we talk about that a bit more, I guess we can do it like one by one and how this all comes together. So, I mean, the first thing you talk about in the chapter is independent wrestling. And I think it's like a lot of people don't know maybe independent wrestling as much as other people do. A lot of people just know John Cena and The Undertaker. They know the big stage. They don't know what it's like to go to an Eve show with 100 people scattered around the ring, or even a larger indie show with 1,000 people, which is what this one's more like. It's independent wrestling is interesting because it's gritty, but it's also more real, and it's harder to keep the kayfabe there with that audience.
Yeah.
I mean, that was my sort of take out of what you were writing here. I don't know how you would explain more about the independent wrestling element.
Yeah, so I think you're spot on the fact that independent wrestling is this really unique ecology because, one, there's a lot more freedom to try things creatively. So in terms of the stories that you can tell in wrestling, you have a lot of freedom to try things and fail in independent wrestling because the stakes are considerably lower. You might have a couple hundred people there live. You might even have a bigger audience with streaming services nowadays and with the ability to view shows through Twitch or through independent TV or these other things. But you still have the freedom to try a couple things, and if they fail, you can abandon them with relatively low stakes. And if they succeed, they can gain momentum and start to build reputations for individual wrestlers or managers or performers. They can build reputations for whole promotions even. So there's this piece where you can really try new things. It's a testing ground. It's a training ground. You're actually learning the craft on independent wrestling. Wrestlers, there are, a lot of those independent promotions are training schools as well. That's really, really important to keep in mind. So it's a place to learn, to grow, to try, to potentially fail, and to hopefully succeed. But then there's this other piece where, because it's part of local communities and there's lots of local identities at stake there, you can't keep up the illusion for too long, because, these are people that you're going to see before and after the show, right? Maybe you're sharing a smoke with them in the alley. Maybe you run into them in your grocery store just randomly one day. I remember when I was living in Seattle, I was on a bus home from Portland visiting some friends and ran into one of the local wrestlers from a Promotion 321 battle on the bus. So it was like, how do you keep the illusion alive when that very real person is in front of you?
Sometimes the Eve champion just stands on your feet at a show when you're watching it, or you bump into Trent Seven on the underground. Those are my examples.
Yeah, and you said it, like, how you can't really keep kayfabe separate when very real people who you get to know and get to care about as human beings are in your face regularly, and you're having that one-on-one contact with them. Oftentimes I don't know, there's something magical about independent wrestling and independent wrestling fans, because they want the stories, they want to believe in the fiction so badly, but they also want to see the very real people succeed, and that's cool.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen much of Progress, the UK company.
I've seen some matches. I haven't followed it, but I know Progress.
The reason I bring them up is because I've been to a bunch of their shows at the Electric Ballroom. They're very popular. But once a year now, they've done it 2 years in a row, they do a retro show. So you've got all these guys that you've been watching wrestle, and they've been in proper feuds with each other. And the one I went to, the most recent one was set in 1988, but I went to the one set in 1978. And they have wrestlers doing gimmicks from that era, just completely playing
fantastic.
It up. The whole theme of the show is completely different, and I guess you'd say it's non-canon, but it's all these guys that you've been watching have these amazing matches, and they really care about the belts, and they come out and do it completely differently. There was a guy, Paul Robbo, they know him as. He's Will Ospreay's tag partner, hardcore wrestler, very violent, think like Jimmy Havoc style. Mm-hmm. And then on the 80s show, he came out as like an 80s dancer, and he came out to what's the Patrick Swayze movie, Time of Our Lives?
Dirty Dancing.
Yeah, that was his theme tune. And he danced to the ring, completely different character.
Oh, I love it.
But it sort of shows but the same people go to both shows. And it's just a case of like being in the moment of what you're accepting in that particular moment versus what you actually, what is actual real, and being able to embrace it.
Yeah. 321 Battle is so much like that in Seattle. I'm such a fan of their work. It's probably one of my favorite promotions, if not my absolute favorite promotion to go to live shows for. That's where Ref Aubrey got her start as a Girl Hebner, which is my favorite ref name in the world.
That is good.
See, you can't see here, I'm doing a visual gag. This isn't great for podcasting, but I do have a lovely Girl Hebner pin on my jacket here.
I didn't realize she was Girl Hebner. That's quite a cool.
Yeah. So that promotes. I know that video went viral a little bit, where she was doing the Dance with Sunny Kiss to Gloria Estefan, which was a treat, and that might have actually been that was the last 321 Battle show I actually went to before leaving Seattle. So that was really cool to get to see live. But it's just that, like, you can have a dance break in the middle of a match, and because the fans there love the characters and love the promotion and love the people, they just buy it. It's not even a question. It's, yes, I will go along with this because this is fun and I'm having fun.
And it stretches it, because that can be in the middle of a show where everything else you accept is real. And then this one might happen, which none of us believe this is real. This is silly, but then we go back to believing it is real afterwards. It's a very unusual sort of world you get at indie events, in terms of keeping kayfabe, but accepting how much you stretch it.
Yeah, and that's so important so I'm going to rein it back into the Candice match, right? Yeah. So this is so important to that match because, and this is going to mix it into some of the other ecologies, but they get to try a hardcore match with a female competitor being the central agent, the central wrestler. That story is about her in that match. Like, it is a tag match, but it is about her. And no mainstream promotion would have done that, would have taken that risk to be like, yeah, you know what, we'll bloody her up. We'll like beat her up to the point that she is bleeding.
Especially 2014.
For her to have the victory.
If you go back to 2014, at that point, we still had the butterfly belt, right?
Yes.
That was still, it was still Divas.
That was still Divas title, butterfly belt. That was before the Give Divas a Chance hashtag happened. This was before the last 5 years of women's wrestling was even imaginable. So for her to have such an authoritative performance at an indie show, and a bigger indie show, because Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, PWG, you know, they have DVD distribution, they have people watch from around the world. She is making this very clear declarative statement, like, look at what I am willing to do as a wrestler. Look at what I'm capable of doing as a wrestler. Hire me, book me. And it's such a declarative statement for anyone to make on an indie scene. To bleed on an indie show is a declarative statement no matter what. But for a woman in 2014 to do that as the central storyline element of a match is huge. It's unthinkable. You cannot stress how important that is to the development of women's wrestling.
Yeah, and so we're crossing into the other areas, so like, hardcore wrestling, women's wrestling, and intergender all combined. And we talk about the hardcore bit there as well. So that was the story of hardcore wrestling, and like we think of, some people just go, oh, Mick Foley covered in blood. Some people say Jimmy Havoc stapling people. You don't often think women taking a thumbtack boot to the face and bleeding everywhere.
Yeah.
So it's like, and I think the interesting bit, I think you talk about it in when it comes to hardcore wrestling, and it ties into the kayfabe part as well, in terms of we're happy to watch these guys hit each other as long as it doesn't go too far. Did this go too far, like this particular moment? And also, but if there's a real injury, that's when people get more worried. It's just like the absurdity of like, hit her with a thumbtack boot, but God, someone's gone down holding their arm and they're not getting back up. Now I'm worried.
Yeah, I talk before I get into these ecologies in the chapter, I talk about this idea of rhetorical ambiguity, and how because of kayfabe, all actions in a wrestling ring, including bleeding, have some element of rhetorical ambiguity. Is it real, or did it happen on purpose, or is it some weird combination of the two? Is it a happy accident, as a Bob Ross would say? Like, what, in the heat of the moment, it's oftentimes very difficult to pinpoint the authenticity of blood. But it doesn't matter if it's authentic, why it came about. What matters is that because it's there, all of a sudden the action gets more real. Even if it's intended, whether if it's a blade job, it doesn't matter. If it's even like an intentional hard way, like the presence of blood in and of itself reminds viewers that it's dangerous, and there's always an element of this could go wrong, always. And that's what hardcore wrestling brings to the surface. It plays with those emotions of this could go wrong, and horribly so, at any time. And for a certain type of viewer, that is an exciting type of match.
Yeah, and I'm not a guy that likes hardcore wrestling. It's known on the pod. I'm the guy that calls, I don't mind hardcore wrestling. I don't like garbage wrestling. Hardcore wrestling I'm cool with. I mean, like this, when it's done well, like this, it makes sense. When it's just people hitting each other with light tubes, I don't find anything clever and interesting about that.
It has to be part of the match.
Yeah, when it's done this way, this mattered. You know, to go back to your main point, like,
yes,
it mattered so much, and the fact that Candice LaRae is the one that takes the big spot and has the Crimson Mask, takes the thumbtack boot to the face. I know Joe Ryan ended up with like a crotch full of thumbtacks at one point, and there's some ones like thumbtacks in the mouth, but the big moment is the super kick to Candice LaRae's face, and which makes it matter so much in terms of, it's like they say, I'm trying to think of any woman ever on the main stage, the main product that ever taken a move like that or a moment like that. I don't think so. I'm just trying to think, like, maybe something accidental at some point. Like, the nearest would be, I guess, and this would probably, like, for anyone who hasn't seen it this way, to liken it to when Nia Jax hit Becky Lynch. And again, that was accidental, broke
Mm-hmm.
her orbital bone and her nose, whatever. It was blood everywhere, beaten
Yeah.
up. And that is one of the most iconic moments, that image in wrestling of recent years. And
Uh-huh.
I guess it's tied into the same reason in terms of, oh, Becky shouldn't look like that.
Yes. Yeah. A human being shouldn't look like that. And then you have the shock of a woman shouldn't look like that. And yet it is in both cases, and with Candice and with Becky, it is pride. It is not a badge of being a victim. I say in my chapter, it's not a mark of being a victim, but a victor. Because she is able to stand there bloodied, battered, but victorious and powerful, that is a mark of strength. It is a mark of the good old intestinal fortitude. It is, I don't know, it's a badge of pride and honor in those circumstances. But yet, if you don't understand the context, it can be so misread as something else to outsiders.
Yeah. And that really leads into, if we talk about the next, of the three, women's wrestling
Mm-hmm.
there, ties nicely into that. And it's the
Mm-hmm.
whole, is this woman a victim? I mean, when it came to Becky and Nia Jax, okay, it's a woman on woman hitting each other
Mm-hmm.
there. It's a little
Yes.
different and it's still unexpected to have that happen. But what stands out, I mean, and we talk about intergender in it, but women's wrestling in general, those two, fighting, the blood was very rare in WWE. So
Mm-hmm.
Candice LaRae back in 2014, I mean, we'll make sure we sort of post out some images of it, but it's an iconic image of her covered in blood. I think it's one of those famous images, on the indie scene. People still refer to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you talk about in the chapter, women's wrestling is not meant to have that. Women are always seen as lesser than men. And
Historically, yeah.
and this is before, give divas a chance. And the only woman before this anyone would think about, a woman, can be as badass as men would be China. But she was treated very differently. But general women's matches, and never mind intergender, just women, they weren't given this kind of opportunity.
No, not at all.
It's sort
Never.
of just wouldn't have happened. So then in the chapter I think you go into detail about women's wrestling and how this is kind of a new thing. And
Yeah.
this is why it matters that Candice LaRae is doing this.
Mm-hmm. So one of the reasons why I use this as an example of mattering is because looking at each of these ecologies, you sort of have to look at a little bit different, right? Independent wrestling, while its weight that it carries in the scope of the wrestling world in general has greatly increased since this match happened, that is less important than how the landscape of women's wrestling has changed since this match happened. And especially because I'm trying to make the point that this match, this moment, is essential for shifting the narrative around women's wrestling, for shifting the perspective of women in the sport. So with that kind of in mind as, what I think matters in this match, we have an example here of a woman doing something absolutely unheard of and doing it well, doing it with the support of her tag team partner, who is now one of the biggest independent wrestlers in the world, with the support of the Young Bucks, who have now gone on to start a rival mainstream wrestling company to the WWE. I don't want to use rival, an alternative mainstream wrestling company, because it's not a rivalry, but an alternative mainstream product that was unheard of when this match happened. But the Bucks were one of the most respected tag teams on the circuit. They were like, yep, Candice gets this moment. The promotion itself, PWG, all of the boys behind that promotion had to be behind Candice because this was a title match. So she is not just bleeding. She is not just winning. She is winning a tag team title at the end of this for her team. So she must have had a lot of people believing in her to be the central star of this story and to come out as a champion. And that was not happening other places in wrestling, was not happening maybe anywhere else except Japan, right? Japan is sort of the outlier in this because the Joshi tradition is just so deep and so rich that the critiques that you apply to women's wrestling elsewhere sort of don't apply, especially not in the same way in Japan. But they do apply in, North America and Europe and a lot of other places. So this match and this moment really demonstrated that women can be a marketable, viable talent that you can build storylines, championship reigns around, because this match just kept getting play and kept getting play, and it was being shared amongst people, and everyone needed to see this. And, oh, you haven't watched this match, you need to watch this match. Like, Candice is like, she is tough, she will kill you. Like, that gained so much authentic support over the years from people continuing to talk about it, that you had no choice. You couldn't just say it doesn't work to have a woman in a main event spot. You couldn't say that you can't have a woman that men will get behind. Like, those old critiques just don't stand in the face of that match and its reception, which is, again, you look at the trajectory of things that have happened since then. We've now had women's champions in independent promotions. Chikara had a female champion, 3-2-1 Battle had a female champion, ECCW in British Columbia, Canada had women's, like, we have now women being grand champions of promotions. We have women being featured as central characters and storylines. And that does not happen at the rate it does without Candice bleeding the way that she did in that match.
I mean, it's interesting just thinking about this time, going back to this time in 2014, and just looking at what WWE was doing, and it's interesting because it was in that run-up. You still had, you were getting a bit like Kelly and like Nikki Bella to be champions. You still saw the occasional one like a Beth Phoenix, and it's around 2014, but you start getting the AJ Lee and the Paige feud going back and forward. It's still for the butterfly belt, but you saw that's when, at least they were given a bit longer in matches, it started happening, and then it's but we're still then dealing with the fact that Nikki Bella gets the belt for like a massively long reign, and it's treated a bit silly until Charlotte wins it in like around this time in 2015 actually. So it's it's interesting watching like what happened there, and then then they deactivated it and they realized, oh, actually women should be allowed to have some respect, but it still took, WWE was still nowhere near the level of like what we're seeing like Candice get that kind of like support, whereas now I think was it this week this week on Raw, the women were kind of the main event on on Raw and SmackDown. They're like the key feature. I think on Raw they were the main event storyline as well, and it's like you could never imagine like them getting that level of like support back in those days that Candice LaRae got.
No, it would have been absolutely unimaginable in 2014 to have said, in 5 years, there's going to be females main eventing WrestleMania. And women's match is going to main event WrestleMania. Like, that is, I cannot stress enough, if you would have told that to somebody in 2014 that would have happened in the next 5 years, they would have laughed at you. Like, oh, yeah, okay, sure. And sure enough, and I love the women in WWE have to put up with so much shit. And they are like, they cannot be revered enough for all of the crap they have to take, all of the terrible writing that happens surrounding their characters, all the shitty character development that is given to them, or lack of character development that is given to them. And yet they still make themselves undeniable in the face of all of that garbage. Like, they are so incredible.
Yeah. At least we've moved on from your catty or your preppy. They've at least moved on a little bit from there and given them that.
Or sexy.
Yeah.
Let's not forget about that either. Like, you're either catty, preppy, or a sex monster. Like, you're just like, I don't.
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, just kind of, I really loved that the women main evented that WrestleMania. It took us a while to get there when that finally happened. I was there waiting until midnight for the match to actually finally happen. That was a long day, but still, everyone thought that was the match which should have headlined. There was no question on it, which is quite.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But so going back to like the writing, so we talked about the women's stuff. We touched on intergender as well, and I think so. The intergender wrestling that's probably, of all the things we talked about, like independent wrestling is more it's taken off. Hardcore wrestling has its place; it always has. Women's wrestling has taken off. Intergender wrestling is still, I guess, it was very taboo then. It's still the taboo area, depending who you talk to. In terms of some just won't do it, some companies won't host it, and there's a real question about man on women violence, or is it unrealistic? But it's interesting that you go into that in quite some detail as well. And we talked about how the rest of the company and the men were willing to work with Candice and put her over. It's like it's a big thing in the chapter. I think you go into it quite a bit, and you talk quite a lot on this. Also, how the women, in the early stages, women do train with men. Just the fact, but it's still taboo, right?
Yeah. So it's baffling to me that in all the progress that we've made around women's wrestling and viewing that as equally viable and equally entertaining as men's wrestling, that there's still this weird controversy about intergender competition, which I can't comprehend personally, but I understand what the arguments are. I recap them in the chapter. But there's this, for some reason, people, and I should be a little more pointed when I say this, because oftentimes it is men who have this disposition, right? There's far fewer female voices that will be like, intergender wrestling isn't believable. Intergender wrestling promotes violence against women. Those are usually men's voices saying those things in the first place. But I make the argument that both of those kind of main categories of resistance are inherently sexist positions that fundamentally ignore kayfabe. So, right, kayfabe tells us that it's an illusion, that no matter what, this is a crafted event performed by professionals, that no matter how you blur the boundaries between what is really going on and what is happening in a story, someone still made the decision to have someone win a match over another person. Someone made the decision to put them in a pairing together in the first place. They are making the decision to work together to tell a story, consensually participating in the match. So to view intergender wrestling as a form or some sort of version of domestic violence, or like will somehow signal encouragement or support for domestic violence, is fundamentally ignoring the fact that it is a fake fight that is consensual. Like, domestic violence is not consensual. Wrestling is consensual. That matter of consent completely changes everything. So to equate it to domestic violence is really a misunderstanding of domestic violence, and sort of really, to me, kind of offensive to people who go through that struggle, who have been abused by a partner, or women who have been battered by men. They're not the same thing. And then there's just the people who say that intergender wrestling is not believable because there's no way that a woman could beat up a man. There's no that the body strength doesn't match. Well, they'll out muscle women, and it's again a fake fight. And in a sport where Rey Mysterio has been a champion, in a sport where we just saw Marco Stunt competing.
I was going to ask you about Marco Stunt as an example.
Yeah, it's just we have precedent for matches where smaller bodies fight bigger bodies. And that's what wrestling is. It's an art form that uses the body to tell a fiction, to create an illusion. Wrestling has more in common with drag than I think any other art form. Well, it's drag and it's theater. It's sort of those two things. That is just using the masculine idea of fighting to tell its story, as opposed to the feminine idea of fashion and making oneself an object. But I don't know. It's baffling to me that people can say that it's not believable when we've seen Rey Mysterio win, when we've seen Marco Stunt get used like he does. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that a little bit. So, anyone who doesn't know Marco Stunt, he is the smallest wrestler probably I've ever seen on a main event show. In terms of, he was just on AEW's second pay-per-view. I mean, I don't like Marco Stunt. I think more I just don't like his. I think maybe it's his look or his wrestling ability. But I've probably got some unconscious bias because of his size. I'm less willing to take him seriously, and that's what I struggle with. But I'm happy to have intergender wrestling. But I look at him and go, I just don't believe you more than I believe a woman could be better off in this match. I've probably got something going on there. But for some people, it's perfectly fine. And then I look at it and go, some people say, oh, women versus men is unbelievable. I'm willing to completely suspend my disbelief about The Fiend. Bray Wyatt lives in some parallel universe where he's been cutting promos, where he's in some sort of existential crisis, limbo in his head. There's all these other layers to it with puppets appearing backstage, and then he comes out. He's carrying his own head as a lantern. You know, he's an amazing performer, but none of that makes any sense.
No.
But I accept it, and some people won't say, "Oh, Becky Lynch should be able to have a match," or "Candice LaRae should be able to have a match with a man." And the only time they accept it is when it's someone larger like China or Nia Jax.
It's mind-boggling to me. I just keep coming back to that. You articulated it so well. It's like we have characters like The Undertaker, one of the most beloved figures in all of wrestling. My man summons lightning. He comes out of a fog. He is the dead man. And we believe that. And yet you can't say that there's no way that Candice LaRae can't fight Finn Balor in a match. Like, tell me that wouldn't be an interesting matchup that they could tell a couple very interesting, that is a cool matchup to me. Let me see the Demon versus Candice LaRae and the kind of chaos that would ensue in that match. Yeah. Let me, there's so, and that's the thing, you're literally denying a whole world of storyline possibilities by not allowing your male and female talent to compete.
Yeah, I'm going to be really interested where AEW goes in this, because I think from their owners are saying they don't really like intergender wrestling, and then I still feel WWE has got the whole our sponsors wouldn't like it to be on our show thing. It feels like that's where they struggle with it, but it just feels like those are the main sort of blockers that we get from it being on a mainstream show, which is why it still says taboo and why it's sort of great when you see it on indie shows sometimes.
Yeah, I have some very serious feelings about this sort of thing on a mainstream level, because if a woman cannot compete for your titles, for your promotion's main championship, their storied championship, then women can never be equal in the sport. Because if you're saying the greats are awarded titles for being the greats, and that a woman can't hold the same title that Ric Flair held, can't hold the same title that Hulk Hogan held, can't hold the same title that John Cena or The Rock or Stone Cold held, then they are fundamentally not equal and can't be, because you're telling them that you can be good, you could be the best of your division, but you can't be the best of the company. And that, to me, is the most frustrating thing to see, because women will always be relegated to second class. The women's title will always be second to the main title if they can't compete for that main title. Further, if you're going to have a women's division, you should also call it your men's division, or else it just comes across as this is a secondary thing, right? Why would you not identify the main roster as a men's division, women's division, and just here's this other separate thing, separate from this main thing that it's fundamentally setting them up as secondary and other if you don't have an equal setup for your men. And if you want to avoid this problem, you either have a men's division championship and a women's division championship, and you're explaining that they are equal titles to be held by men and women as they are, or you have one grand championship that anybody in that company can hold, whether they're a men's champion or a women's champion. What
have you made of Tessa Blanchard versus Sami Callihan in Impact? Have you seen any of that?
I need to watch that. I've heard very good things about that program. I heard that Sami worked it very well and very in a way that was very considerate to attentive to the fact that he was wrestling a woman and in that intergender story. But I need to actually, my time has been so I've cut out so much wrestling product that I want to watch only because there's only so much time in the week. But that is something that I would like to get around to watching.
Yeah. It's fair enough. I think it's been under the radar of a lot of people. I've only seen bits of it, but I'm not a big fan of Sami Callihan in general, but I love Tessa Blanchard, and I've seen her on indie shows, and she's so good.
She owns it. She's just got such a bravado and an aura about her.
I just want to just build on her, the horsewomen, it's a birthright thing, and just end up in WWE and just beat the crap out of everyone and set up a real horseman at some point. That's what I'd love to see it go one day.
That would be great.
We shall see what happens. But that's been quite interesting. So intergender wrestling on I guess Impact isn't as big as it used to be, but it's still a show which is sold around the world, and they're trying to get a new TV deal, and they've been featuring this intergender feud quite heavily. And I think they're still going to be going back to it as well. So
Yeah.
it's interesting that they don't seem to have made a big deal about it. It's almost like it's just happening. We're not making a big fuss about it. It just seems like the right feud to do, rather than making any real like, oh, aren't we revolutionary?
And that's how it should be. You have really talented competitors of all genders available to you to make compelling stories. So look at what's your most interesting stories and go from there. Don't think about, like, the gender is only a factor in how you approach the technical composition of the match, because again, body type. So it matters in terms of if you have a big body or a small body, or if you have bodies that are kind of comparably matched, like using that to tell the story too. But it doesn't matter in terms of character development, in terms of storyline, male and female talent, or just talent. And then also, like, to complicate the question, what do we make of wrestlers like Still Life with Apricot and Pears from Chikara, who is a non-binary wrestler? This is an individual who uses they, them pronouns, who doesn't believe they are man or female, but non-binary. Okay, where do they belong in a men's division or a women's division? Like, all this stuff gets so complicated if you try to keep to rigid, outdated norms and perceptions. But if you just allow competitors to do what they do, and the best talent to take flight with the audience and those relationships to emerge, you can't go, like, that's classic wrestling booking. You're just expanding it to all of the talent you have available.
Yeah. We've gone on quite a bit already. I'm looking at the time. We've definitely we've gone into some of these points in a lot of detail. It's been a great chat. I think so. We touched on the 4 main points there. So hardcore wrestling, women's, intergender, and independent hardcore, women's, intergender. So it's a 50-page piece of work that you've done as part of a larger writing you've been doing. Is there an overall like summary conclusion of that chapter that you would want to sort of highlight?
Yeah, I mean, there's takeaways for like the academic audience that it's written for, that not to say they don't matter here, but are less important for like a wrestling audience. But for a wrestling audience, the big takeaway is that a lot of disparate elements needed to come together for this match to happen how it did, between it being an independent match, between it being a hardcore match, between it being a title match, between it featuring a woman as the main agent fighting alongside and against men. But because all of these factors come together in this iconic visual of Candice donning this crimson mask, we can actually pinpoint a moment in time from which the shape of women's wrestling and intergender wrestling have shifted. And what was unheard of in 2014 is now something that you can see in other places without it being a shock that it's happening in the first place. And for that to happen in only 5 years is pretty intense. So clearly this momentum had to have been building before Candice donned the match. It had to have been bubbling under the surface. But that match and that iconic visual, more than anything else, has really given the struggle of women in the industry a face, like a literal face to point to and be like, that is what we do. Like, we struggle, we bleed just like you. Give us our opportunities. And I think that this match will continue to be a storied match in the history of professional wrestling, like your, Stone Cold versus Bret Hart at WrestleMania versus your Stone Cold and Rock at WrestleMania, Hogan and Rock at WrestleMania. Sorry. There are these sort of storied matches that like people just talk about. Randy Savage versus Macho Man at WrestleMania 3, right? That's one of my favorite.
Macho Man versus Ricky Steamboat.
Steamboat, that is I'm saying far too many things in my brain right now, and it's all
I
getting
still
confusing.
quote that as the best match of all time because you can
Uh,
still watch it today and it holds up.
it is one of my absolute favorite matches of all time. There's a reason why I wrote WrestleMania 3 as WrestleMania 3 with that match being in the bridge, like being like highlighted as it is, because it is one of my absolute favorite matches of all time. It is to me one of the best textbook storytelling matches of all time. Like, you don't need to be a wrestling fan to understand the story that they tell in that match, and it is so wonderful because of that. But yeah, so I think that this match between the Young Bucks and Candice and Joey will become one of those storied matches in history that just people talk about, especially given how all four of these individuals have only become more and more important to the field of professional wrestling in general.
Cool. Right, we're going to take a short break and be back in a moment.
Hey you! If you like the podcast, then remember to like the Holy Shoot Wrestling Podcast on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Holy Shoot Pod. Do it! Do it now!
Right, so we're back. So, Jacqui, we talked a lot about your dissertation, and I've asked you about this in the past, and this would cost a lot of money for someone to buy and get hold of because it's part of a larger academic piece.
Yeah.
Have you got any plans to make like at least some of your writings like on wrestling available, or like you're going to be publishing something?
So I have my ideal goals versus what I'm going to try to do in the short future. So something that I'd like to do is for a while I've wanted to start some kind of like blog, a place for some public writing. And I'd like it to be like public writing about wrestling, something that takes this kind of analytical approach to whether it's like doing a character analysis, whether it's doing, an analysis of a match, like breaking down a match like I do in the chapter, and it's sort of, it's rhetorical significance, maybe doing like rebooking angles. So like, hey, this happened in this promotion. That might not have been a good choice. Let's look at why and what could have been done different. Like, there's all this sort of like commentary that I can make about wrestling from this sort of academic brain. So I'd like to be able to get a blog going with some of that. And what I would do is I'd edit down I'd probably take like little sections from it, because the chapter's composed in sections. Basically take the sections, remove some of like the academic-y stuff that just doesn't matter for a public audience, and then like put, shorter, more condensed versions of some of that out there. And then in an ideal world, I would love this Candice chapter to become a full book. I would love to expand each of those little sections into a full chapter in and of itself and actually have a whole book about that match in that moment. But that requires, other people and resources saying, yes, we will give you money to make this book. So that is an ideal world.
I should like hook you up with Heather and how she did her book. Heather Vandenberg, she did it all through the Unbound site and got funding to justify it that way. So maybe that's a route you could go down.
That is a good way. Yeah, and I need to order a copy of that too, because now that I've got some reading time back in my life, I need to prioritize that book.
It's a really good book, definitely worth reading it. I loved chatting to her about it in the past and going to the book launch when she did it and sort of seeing it take off. But I think there's definitely I'd love to sort of see your kind of writing. There isn't that really, I guess, clever academic brain doing this. There's lots of websites that are just badly written. There's some historians that I love to read, but there are a lot of people voicing their opinion, and it's not in a way that's actually interesting and has value. So like, if you could do something, that would be awesome to be able to read. Yeah, definitely. In terms of academic, definitely some of the words. I definitely had to look up some of the words that were very academic when I was reading the chapter. Yeah. Definitely sort of getting the balance right there.
Yeah.
In terms of your other writing, though, so yeah, hopefully the book stuff will work out in the blog as well. But the other thing we wanted to talk about is like, you're also a songwriter when it comes to like, and it's songs about wrestling. So this is back on episode 8, which God, this was a long time ago. I swear this was like January or something.
It was over the winter, yeah.
Yeah. And we did an episode that I made the guys do. I'm gonna put that out. I'm gonna extract. We did it as like a long episode because we were talking about the Royal Rumble. I'm gonna extract that one bit and do it as like a bonus episode and put that out as well, just talking about music and also make reference to the B Plus Players' new album as well. So we'll put that as a future episode. But in that episode, we talked about the best albums, about proper like albums, not John Cena and Macho Man, but actual musicians and we talked about you know, your band Cheap Pop. We talked about B Plus Players, Mega Ran, and the Mountain Goat. There's some really good like wrestling music out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I said like your album that you did was Cheap Pop. It was back in 2016, called it was In Gorilla, wasn't it? Was the album title?
Yeah, In Gorilla. Yeah.
Yeah, I talked about it as my favorite just because it had the most emotion and the most like thinking going on in terms of the actual writing of the songs. So I really enjoyed it. I guess, you know, we there's a few songs we can go into in particular, but I guess just in general, how did that all come about? How did you guys decide to write an album about like rock music wrestling?
Yeah, I have been a musician pretty much my whole life. You know, I started singing before I have conscious memory of it, gravitated towards playing all sorts of instruments growing up. Mostly, I mean, vocals, I have like classical proper training, but other instruments I've, you know, self-taught myself how to play. So making music is like breathing for me. It's just something natural and that I can't live without. So with that sort of background piece in mind, I was hanging out with some friends. We were watching wrestling. It was probably some random pay-per-view. And somebody says the phrase cheap pop, probably in the room or even on TV, who knows. And
Mick Foley may have been on TV.
This was probably in, I'm trying to place a timeline on this. I'm going to say this was in sometime probably in 2013. So somebody mentions the phrase cheap pop, and Nick, my husband and our bassist, goes, that'd be a good band name. And that was the only comment. And I look immediately at him and go, no, that would be a great band name for a band about wrestling. And that was it for a little while. We're all like, yeah, that'd be a good idea. That's cool. But then like this, I don't know if this happens with other people out there who play music or who create things with their friends, but like you throw an idea, everyone loves it, but no one gets the ball rolling on it. So it just stays an idea for a while. But I had such a clear sense of what this band could be from that moment. I was like, oh, cheap pop. This has got to sound like a pop punk band. It's got to sound like cheap pop music, and it's got to have this metaphor in it, but it's got to be about wrestling. So like I immediately just had this vision for what this band could be. So, you know, I'd mentioned earlier that I was working on my master's thesis in 2013, 2014. And this was sometime in the winter of 2013. It was sometime maybe between November and January. So like right in that window around the new year, I was getting pretty stressed with the thesis writing because it can be overwhelming, and I needed an outlet just to do something different and get my brain away from some of that stress. And clearly I was thinking a lot about Daniel Bryan because I was writing about him academically. So I sat down with my guitar and was just like, I'm going to write a cheap pop song. I'm going to write a song about Daniel Bryan. It's going to be a fan letter to him. So I sat down and pretty much in one session, minus a couple lyrics in the second verse, had Daniel Bryan Danielson. And that was the first cheap pop song. And they just started coming from there. You know, it was just, that was the one song that I needed to be able to get the momentum going. And from there, I'm sort of the chief songwriter. You know, most songs are just me and my guitar and my brain wandering, with a couple, you know, exceptions in there. So.
And back on the episode 8, I think I talked about my favourite song being, and I think I went into a bit of detail about Double Turn and how amazing that is as a song. And it's just like the ability to talk about Bret Hart versus Stone Cold Steve Austin. I think it was WrestleMania 13, wasn't it? I think that's.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, and how, you know, and I explained how you covered so much in this one song, and how that was actually the match that started the Attitude Era, and how you talked about it in a great detail and the actual emotion of that match. And that I love that one. That's my favorite.
Thank you. Yeah, and that one was an interesting one because I had written the chorus. And for me, the chorus is, a lot of my songs start with the chorus because, like, that's the main idea of the song. So, like, you know, it helps me get, oh, that's what this song is. But it took me a while to figure out the verses on that because originally I thought I was going to be telling the story of the whole match. And then it dawned on me one day, oh, this story isn't about the whole match. This story is just about the finish and what that meant for professional wrestling. And as soon as I could narrow down what the actual song was about, the rest of it came pretty quickly.
I love that. There's some good shouting on that one, for lack of a better way to put it, in terms of getting into the emotion. But it's all good, like sort of, punk pop type stuff, as you say, in terms of the stuff. And there's other great stuff on there, about the struggles of being a babyface, a love letter to Paige, Brod's favourite, Brod, who'd hosts all of our wrestling challenge episodes, his favourite is the song about JBL's flask, and how JBL generally seems to be drunk on TV during that time period.
For real, man. That was an ongoing joke with my group of friends, was just every time he would make just some outlandish comment that sounded like your drunk uncle would make at a party, it was oh, there's JBL's flask again. So I had to write a song. I'm so happy other people noticed that about his commentary.
Yeah, I think a lot of the guys on there, we picked, we had similar thoughts, I think, to some of the stuff you were talking about. And then there was some sort of more the wrestling historians that really appreciated things like Double Turn and WrestleMania 3. A little march through the entire WrestleMania 3 card as a song is quite impressive.
Yeah, that was fun to write too. That's a challenge too, because I'm all right, how do I try to get as many of these matches in the song as possible? That's a little writing challenge to myself, It doesn't matter to other people, but it matters to me.
And obviously, this album, all the cheap pop songs can be found on Spotify, on Bandcamp, and I assume iTunes and other places.
Yeah, they're on iTunes. It's
everywhere.
Pretty much anywhere you can get music, you can get in Gorilla.
I recommend people check it out. And I got all the guys into it a little bit before we went to WrestleMania, so it's one of the main sort of albums we were able to listen to while we were sort of chilling out in our apartment. It was very good. It's definitely something to listen to before you go to a show. It definitely gets.
Oh, that's the best.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's cool.
And are you working on it? I know you've been distracted by the fact you've been doing a lot of academic writing. Are you planning to get some more songs out at some point?
Yeah, we do have a plan. So a little while ago, almost about a year and a half ago at this point, we had recorded 3 songs for a split with the Razor Ramones, which is another wrestle punk band. And that is still technically forthcoming. There's still plans to release that, but who knows when that will be out. But there's 3 songs forthcoming with that. One about the Genius. They're all about specific wrestling. These are all wrestling profiles. So one is about the Genius, which, funny story, all the verses are limericks. So a little nod to his poetry.
Very, very clever. So anyone who does not know the Genius, look at some of his promos, and they were
so good.
Everyone says he only got a job because he's Macho Man's brother, but he had his own little gimmick going there.
I really enjoy him. The second song is about Terry Funk. And it's called Never Retire because he will never retire. And the last song is about Bret the Hit, not Bret the Hitman, Shawn Michaels' Heartbreaker era Shawn Michaels. So when he was the Heartbreak Kid. So the song's called Heartbreaker. And it's just specifically about that version of Shawn Michaels.
The one, is it, we talking earrings and mirror and shades era?
Yes, that early to mid 90s, white pants with a broken heart on it, dangler in one ear, that era.
I see Champion era. Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So those hopefully be out at some point.
Yep, and then we got about half the songs for another full length and written and ready to go. Clearly haven't been able to work on them in the last year and a half. But now that I'm back on the East Coast, now that the band's literally all in the same place again, because my drummer's been, here the whole time, we're going to start ramping up practices again, starting to get going on some shows again. And hopefully next year we'll be recording and releasing another full length. That would be ideal.
Cool. I said the same thing to the B+ player. So you need to try and get Conrad Thompson to check you guys out for the next, because I'm sure he'll do another Starcast, and it's either book yourself for shows around it or try and get on the actual thing.
I would love to try to get on it.
Come on, dude, this is perfect for the after party or something at some point. So I always said definitely sort of trying to reach out to that guy.
I would love to do that.
I think before we sort of play us out with some music, I just want to check. I know that you're a big fan of Eve Wrestling as well.
I am.
And I think it's we've talked about Eve a few times, and we've even ended up you messaging me when I was at Chris Wolf's retirement show for Eve and all the other things, and Heather Vandenberg's tie into it. I'm going to try and get Emily and Dan. I've emailed Emily a few times in the past. I was sort of we've exchanged messages, so I would definitely try and get this her way and say you need to listen to this because she'd love it, and try and get her into it.
Man, Emily Reed just seems like such a kindred spirit. Everything that I just see about her like from her public facing persona, just seems like we could talk for days about music, about just, feminism, about wrestling, about just any host of things. Like, I believe so much in what Eve is doing, in the spirit of it. It's punk, it's feminist, it's unapologetic. It is creating and booking and portraying strong women of so many different body types and backgrounds and character traits. It's just some of the most exquisite work out there in the wrestling scene.
Yeah, she is cool. And whenever I spoke to Dan more at some of the live events I've been to, but whenever I see Emily, she's always so good with the fans as well, and they're very like all inclusive as well. So it's like everything you're talking, you're into, and you're talking about in the chapter we talked about. She's definitely someone I think we'll hopefully get her to check it out. I think she'd love to sort of read more. And just same thing like Heather. I think I'll get her to make sure I point this out to her, because I'm going to get Heather back on the show at some point and sort of stay to her. She's very pregnant at the moment.
Oh, yes.
She's very, very pregnant.
That will change some things.
Yeah, that slowed her down a little bit. But
I imagine.
But I think the plan is to catch up later in the year about how the book's gone and everything as well. And she's like, we talked off air about like I'm trying to put together maybe a little writing project, and she's up for being involved in that as well. So trying to sort of pull that together with a few people that know how to write, basically. So,
yeah, I would. That's sort of a next step. We talked a little bit earlier about some next steps, but that's something else too. Like, I'm just trying to hook up with the people who are trying to write about wrestling and get some projects going, because I don't know. We are riding the wave of a boom. It is happening. AEW is going to usher in a public conversation about wrestling that we haven't had in like 20 years in mainstream, at least American culture. And it now is the time for like the people who think a lot about wrestling to really make our voices public.
Yeah. Well, we'll carry on our discussion off air about this little idea of mine about women like wrestling book. So we'll see how that one sort of comes along. Before we go, I was going to play us one of your songs, just sort of pick something off of the album. Is there anything you'd like us to end with?
Let's see what to play off the album. I know you've played a couple songs before.
Yeah, but whatever your choice is, we'll play out.
Could I play you a new one?
If you wanted to play us a new one, you could do.
I could do that.
If you've got a good setup for sound-wise, I'm sure it'd be a great thing to have to end on.
Well, why don't I do this? Let me grab my guitar, and I have a song about Mean Gene that has been quietly sitting in the catalog for a couple years, played it at a couple shows live, and now, unfortunately, that he's no longer with us, I feel like it needs to be out there. It needs to be heard.
Cool. If you want to grab your guitar, we'll do that. Sounds
just
good.
a moment. Can't fail with Mean Gene by my side. He's my backstage interview guide. So when I start rambling, losing my way, I know my friend Mean Gene will take it away. Can't crash with Mean Gene at the wheel. He makes sure everything is real. So when I get mixed up, don't know where to go, as always comes Mean Gene to continue the show. Always on, never wrong, quite a friend till the end. Mean Gene is my man. Can't lose when Mean Gene takes the mic. He makes sure every word feels right. So when I get tongue-tied and my heart starts to race, as always comes Mean Gene to help me save face. Always on, never
feel like I need to add like an applause moment there, like some sort of sound effect of like lots of applause.
Thank you.
Cool, that was great. Thank you for that.
No problem.
It's great to get like an exclusive, I guess, sort of
I
on the
know,
show.
so kind to us. So I mean, I figure it makes sense to give you a little something new and different that they can only hear on the Holy Shoot Pod.
Yeah, and then we'll hear like the proper version at some point, which will be a lot louder, I bet.
Oh yeah, it'll be.
So,
I mean, it is a boppy song. It is just a loud, boppy kind of power pop song.
cool. Well, thank you for your time today. Thank you for playing the song. I guess in terms of what we can plug for you, it's like I say, check out Cheap Pop on Spotify, iTunes, and everywhere. And also I'm guessing if your social handle, it's Cheap Pop the band, right?
Cheap Pop is a band.
Cheap Pop is a band, or all the various places.
Yes,
and
you can find us there.
People can then stay track as you start looking at how you're going to publish some of your writings. That's the way I'm guessing they'll be able to hear about it.
Yeah, I will certainly be in touch with all of you at the Holy Shoot Pod with anything that kind of comes out there that you guys can look up and follow, whether it's with me and my own kind of independent scholarship or as a band making some fun music for your ears.
Great. Thank you. It's great chatting today. Have a good rest of your weekend.
Oh, you too.